The least studied but most important is the endgame. Today we will learn a crucial topic on endgames, which is how to win when you have a single pawn left. We will learn direct and distant opposition, magic square, key squares, some exceptions, the rook file pawns, and a tricky position at the end. So stay tuned. First, we will learn about the magic square. The magic square is basically a square drawn around the pawn which determines whether your pawn will queen in time or will your opponent stop it. The square is drawn from the square of the pawn to the end of the board in a diagonal manner. So the square is drawn around it. In this rule, if your opponent king manages to enter this square, then your pawn won't promote in time. If not, your pawn will promote in time. Like in this example, it's white to play, so white pushes his pawn. The square keeps getting smaller as the pawn pushes forward. Black king tries to catch the pawn, but the square keeps getting smaller and white promotes in time. In the same position, if it's black to play and we flip the sides, then here black is able to enter this square and so the white pawn won't be able to promote. So let's play the moves. h6, king to f6, h7, king to g7, and your pawn doesn't promote. So that is the rule of the square. Now let's take a look at key squares. Key squares are nothing but the squares drawn in front of your pawn. Whoever controls these squares will have the result in their favor. Let's put the kings on the board, shall we? This is the main and most important position of pawn endings. In this position, we are going to learn how to win with a concept known as opposition. If both sides are controlling the key squares, then the side who manages to give opposition takes the result. There are two types of oppositions, direct and distant opposition. Direct opposition is basically when you face the opponent king like so. Now let's take a look at how to win once you get opposition. If the black king moves sideways, then you move your king sideways, making room for the pawn to push forward. If the king moves backwards, then here you never ever push your pawn sideways to the king and never ever push the pawn in front of the king. Those positions will usually be drawn as the black king will be able to give opposition, and now black has the result in his favor and this is a draw. So as we know, you never push the pawn sideways. So here we have a chance to give opposition. We'll give an opposition. Now if his king moves sideways, then here you play king to d5, make room for the pawn to push. If the king moves to c7, then you again give opposition. If he moves to b7, you make room for the pawn to push forward. King to b6, now your king is far advanced, so you can push your pawn. It's not sideways nor in front of the king, so it's safe to push the pawn. King to b7, push your pawn. King to c8, remember to give opposition and never move sideways, otherwise black will give opposition and this is a draw. So you give opposition, king moves sideways, you play king to b7, king to d7, you push your pawn, promote a queen and then go on to win the game. Let's do it again. One thing you have to remember is that you have to always calculate that your opponent doesn't give you an opposition, otherwise it will be a drawn endgame. So you give opposition. If he goes king to b5, you make room at the side for your pawn to promote. Goes back, give opposition. King to c7, give opposition. Go sideways, go sideways. Here he gives you an opposition sideways. And it looks like a problem. But here, you must remember that whenever your king is in opposition, if you have a pawn move, then your opponent is in opposition. So, you don't have to worry. If you have a pawn move, then there's no problem if your opponent gives you an opposition. So here currently you have given your opponent an opposition. King to b7, c5, and we give an opposition, make room for the pawn and promote. So that was the concept of direct opposition. Now let's take a look at what is this distant opposition. To learn about distant opposition, we must know about opposition in detail. Opposition is basically when the kings face each other not only close by leaving only one square between them, but by leaving odd number of squares. So those odd numbers are 1, 3 and 5. 7 is not possible on the chessboard. So distant opposition is basically when the kings face each other in more than one square distance between them. So let's take a look at this example. Here, if we play king to f2, this is not an opposition and the game will be in black's favor as black will give us an opposition and Here we will lose the game after black uses fine technique to win the game, as we saw in the previous example. So here we play king to f1, delivering an opposition, leaving 3 squares in between both the kings. This is a drawn endgame as black cannot make any progress. Let's say he moves his king forward, you deliver direct opposition. He moves his pawn, you play king to g2. He moves his pawn again, don't move your king to f1 as black will give you an opposition and black will win this position. So here you play king to g1, wait for black to come in the position where you can give opposition and black will stalemate you at the end of the board. Now let's take a look at some exceptions. In this position, white has done a great job of moving his king sideways and pushing the pawn forward. The problem here is that this pawn is in the b file, and if white pushes his pawn to promote, this is a stalemate as black cannot move. So in this position, white has to play king to b6 to win the match. Black can give opposition, but that's the exception. You have to move your king sideways. If your king tries to get stalemated, here you play b6. King to b8, you play b7. King to c7, you protect your pawn, and in the next move you promote. So the exception here is that on the 8th rank, if you get an opposition, it's not always a drawn game. Sometimes you can move your king sideways and promote your pawn like so. Now let's take an example of the same concept, and this time you have to think and find the best move. Pause the video if you like. Very good job. Here black has given you an opposition, so you have to move sideways. If black king tries to get stalemated, you push your pawn, and here you play g7, you leave one square for your opponent king to run away, and you promote your pawn into a queen. Now let's take a look at the concept of rook file pawns. Rook file pawns are basically the pawns at the side of the board, that is the h file and the a file, that is where the rooks are placed. So in these positions, basically if you have a pawn, you have to try and not let the opponent king run into the corner, otherwise it's a draw. So for that you have to shoulder the opponent king and make way for your pawn to promote. Here black has no chance of entering the corner square, and he just has to play random moves until you promote into a queen and checkmate him later on. Now let's see what happens when we don't have a pawn. When we don't have a pawn, we have to try to reach the corner to draw the game. Here it's our turn, so we can move towards the corner without black shouldering our king in time. If he pushes his pawn, we play king to b1, king to b3, king to a1, a2 is a stalemate, and we draw the game. Now let's take a look at the tricky position I spoke about in the start. It's white to play. Can you spot the best move? Well, if you thought of king to d2 and try to protect your pawn and promote, this is wrong, as black can play king to e7. Here, if you move your king forward, black will give distant opposition, and he will give direct opposition soon, and this is a drawn endgame. Well, you will say that here we can give distant opposition. Once we play king to e3, we are leaving 3 squares in between our kings, and white can win this match. But no, black can play king to d7. You again give a distant opposition, and the problem here for you is that once black moves to the c file, your pawn obstructs your king and you cannot give distant opposition anymore. If you move your king forward, black will give direct opposition and the position is drawn. So that's why in the starting position, you must play king to c2. Now you're moving your king towards the left side of the board, so you have no problem of black king delivering an opposition. If black king tries to come forward, you play king to b3, king to d6, you play king to b4, making way for your pawn to push, king to c6, don't push your pawn sideways to your king, give an opposition, king moves sideways, let's say d6, then you play king to b5, make room for the pawn to push, king to c7, give an opposition, king to d7, king to b6, push your pawn, goes back, push your pawn, goes to the last rank, give an opposition, sideways, move sideways, king to b7, c6, push your pawn, promote into a queen and win the game. If you don't want to get surprised by your opponent and fall into a trap in the opening, then here is the next lesson for you. It will help you play good moves even if your opponent surprises you in an opening.